This is Jim with Twisted Hobbies. Today we're building a 39-inch Crak Yak. Okay, today we're going to be building the Crak Yak 1 meter, and we have the plane itself. We have the manual. I downloaded this from the website and printed it out. We have the power combo, which includes your servos, your ESC, your motor and propeller. Separately from the power combo, there's the receiver and trusty foam tack. This is my favorite adhesive, although you can use any type of adhesive you want.
Okay, we are going to open up our foam tack and then open up our box, get all of our parts spread out a little bit, and then we're going to look for the surfaces that all need to be folded over. I'm going to fold these over for about an hour, just put a battery on top of them. This is a great time to be able to bind my receiver, calibrate my ESC, and center my servos. I also check for motor direction. There's a whole video on this in the description. Then we're going to cut apart the fuselage, take out the little extra piece between those, and then I'm going to find these edge strips that go down the horizontal fuselage. I dry fit those into place, fill it with some foam tack, and then press those in. This is also a good time to get out the parchment paper. That way you don't end up gluing anything to the table. We're going to do the other side. I'm using the screwdriver just to push it in flush, and then we're going to move on to the wings. This plane has a different setup than most others I've made altogether. It makes kind of a sandwich between the wing spars and that plywood piece that's in there. And what I should do here is glue on both parts of the horizontal fuselage, so this one here and that one, but I did it separately. So then once I got those glued into place, then I put this one on. I don't know why I did it like that, but make sure to do that all at one time. Do not put glue on the joint between the two halves of the horizontal fuselage though. That needs to stay open because you're going to need to cut it. I have this handy slot cutter tool that I got from Twisted Hobbies, and I have it set to cut at a depth of 3.5 millimeters. And you'll see that I'm cutting the slot only to the length of the spar, and it goes right through that slot between the two horizontal fuselage halves. I fill it with some foam tack, and that goes all the way across. Then we put our spar into place. I push it down a little bit with a screwdriver, and then we're going to flip it over. Make sure you use your parchment paper so you don't glue it to the table. And then we're going to open up the slot a little bit more for that plywood piece. And I'm just using an X-Acto blade because it's a little too deep for the slot cutter. And then that's able to fit into place. Now that's going to go down a little bit below the depth, so that way the rest of the spar for the top side can go all the way in. I cut that slot, dry fit it to make sure everything's good, fill it with foam tack, and then we are ready to push the spar all the way in and come at it with the screwdriver and push it all the way down. Then I'm going to press all these surfaces together. I'm going to let it sit for a few minutes, and then I'm going to press them together again quite a few times to make sure they're fitting snugly. Now we're going to be putting on the spars for the elevator, and we're just going to continue the line across there on both sides. Fill it with some foam tack on each side. Then we can attach the horizontal stabilizer and elevator, and you'll see that I push these together, I pull it apart, leave it for a few minutes, and then push it together for a final tack. Now we can work on the servos, putting on my servo horns, and getting them put into place in the fuselage. You see I dry fit them, and then I push them down, and their little tabs make a little indent, so that tells me where to cut a little, so that way they'll slide all the way in, and I can get a little bit of glue in there. Now I'm working on the G10 fiberglass pieces, and for those I'm just cleaning up any edges or anything. I'm scuffing them up so that they'll adhere great, and then I'm going to go and paint them because I don't like the yellow look that they have. I'd rather them be black, so I'm just going to hit them with a few coats of black spray paint after I glue this together. There they are. They look beautiful now. So now I can apply some foam tack to that, get it into the right place, and then we can put the vertical fuselage onto the horizontal fuselage. I almost forgot that servo, so I glued that servo into there as well. I'm making sure all the wires go over to the other side of the plane because that's just how I set it up. So I had to cut a little slot for one of the aileron wires to go underneath. And then I put it into place. I use my square to make sure everything is square, and it's going to all fit great. Now we're working on the aileron control horns. Those two are identical. The other two horns are different shaped. Then I'm using the straight edge to decide where I'm going to place the aileron control horns, and I'm just lining it up with the servo arm and then getting those horns glued in. And now we're going to be assembling the aileron push rods. So I grab those pieces out of the hardware kit and then just start assembling them. I get them dry fit together, making sure that they're in the right place. And then we're just going to add some CA glue. The distance on these is pretty critical because there's really no adjustment after you get it glued together. So make sure that the ailerons are in a neutral position and then you can get them glued. Next up, we're going to be gluing in the motor mount, and you'll see that I did paint my motor mount black. I'm just going to put some foam tack into there and press it into place. And then we're working on the canopy and the vertical fuselage. And now that that's together, we are going to install the servo. And I just open it up a little bit where that little tab sticks in, feed the wire through, and then we're going to add glue all the way down. Make sure to get glue on the motor mount area as well. And then I'm going to use my square to make sure that everything is coming together perpendicular. That's looking great. Now we're going to be doing the bracing on the bottom of the fuselage. And on this side, I put glue just all the way down the side, get it into place. I put it even with the bottom of the horizontal fuselage. And then on this side, I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the small Crak Yak, which is not glue in the first 6 inches or so. That way we can still mess with the wiring. Now we're going to work on the rudder hinges. So I cut a slot for these and get them in, and then I sort of push up against it to make a mark where it's going to fit into the rudder. Then I glued it in place on the horizontal fuselage. Once that dries, I'll come back and then glue it into the rudder. Now we're gluing in all of the push rod guides. And you'll notice that these push rod guides have 2 different sets. On this side that I'm doing now, that is the one for the elevator, and they get bigger as they go towards the elevator. On the other side for the rudder, they are all the same size. Next up, we're going to open up the slot for the elevator control horn, and then dry fit that into place. Same thing with the rudder, that cuts all the way through. And then just make sure it's even on both sides. Now we're going to attach the clevises to the push rods. And I'm just going to sand these ends up a little bit. And then we'll use some CA glue on the little brass threaded pieces. And then put on the clevises. Next, these little white pieces get pushed into the other end of the clevises. And this is a great time to put on my elevator control horn. That way I don't have to try and get that little pin through while it's on the plane. And then we put on the servo horn, which is easier to get to from the underside. I just went between the bracing and the fuselage. Then we attach the clevis to the elevator control horn. We trim the push rod and glue it in place. Same thing over on the side for the rudder. I attach the clevis to the rudder control horn. Make sure that the push rod is the right length, cut it, insert it into the clevis, and then glue it in place. Now we're ready to move on to our landing gear. Those need a couple holes, and they have those at 36 millimeters apart. So I mark them, and then I drill them. I start with a very small drill with my pin vise, and then I move up in size. Once those holes are drilled, we're going to thread it through and then screw it into the landing gear plate. But before you do this, I would recommend that you drill the holes for the axles on the wheels to go through first, because that's probably easier to do when it's off of the plane. Next up, we're assembling the wheel pants. And they just get glued together. Just make sure there's a left and a right. And then we're going to start assembling the wheels and pants together and then attach them to the gear itself. First, I open it up a little bit with the pin vise, and here's the layout for how everything should come together. And then I'm just going to assemble each one of these. It can be a little tricky to get it all together and tightened up right, but after a couple tries, I usually am able to make it so that the wheel spins freely and we're able to get the whole assembly together. And at this point, I realized I probably should have drilled these holes before I screwed it together onto the plane, because it's always easier to do when it's off the plane. But I get those opened up. And here's what it looks like all done. The manual says that you can cut off the excess bolt. I didn't worry about it on mine. I would recommend some Loctite or some CA glue to keep those nuts from coming off. Then we put on the tail skid. And then we're going to work on our side force generators and our canalizer. The small side force generators go on the outside edge. Once I got those set, I just made sure that they were parallel and then glued the bigger ones in place. And now onto the canalizer. It's got a little support and then it all glues together. I had to take out just a little bit to make it fit all the way in. And then we're ready to start installing the electronics. I'm going to screw the motor into the motor mount. And then run my ESC and receiver wiring. I'm going to try and stuff it all back here underneath this support, and then I'll glue the support in place. Next up is prop balancing. Just added a little bit of tape. This one balanced pretty quickly. And then make sure that your prop nut is very snug. You don't want that coming off while it's flying. Now I'm getting set up to do the center of gravity. And I use a little pencil to mark a couple places. And then figure out where I want the Velcro to go for the battery that I'm going to be using. And I'm just cleaning everything up, getting it all put together and tidy, so it's a neat, clean install. Then I glue down my Velcro, and we are ready for the maiden flight. Okay, for this maiden flight, I want to say first that I think that this area is probably too small for me flying this plane. It's about 60 feet by 60 feet. If I were a better pilot, I could probably do more with it, but it is a little too tight for me here. So what I'm really trying to do is make sure the plane's flying as I intend it, and just see how it flies. And I was hoping for something kind of in between the Crak Yak and the Velocity, and that's exactly what it is. It is nimble, but yet still has a pretty big presence. So it flies just as great inverted as it does upright, and you'll see here that I'm using a Harrier a little bit to keep it into the wind. There's just a little breeze going on today. I've got a buddy that always asks me, how much does your plane weigh? And it weighs 343 grams without the battery, and at just under 400 with. I'm using a 3S 720 milliamp hour battery, and it seemed to be the perfect size for it to really make it light. You can go a little heavier, but the 720 I think is the best way to go. I didn't really have to do any playing around with where the battery location was. It seemed to do really well just where the manual said it should be. I didn't have to do any trimming. It seemed to balance perfectly right out of the box. And overall, I really like the way it flies. I'm excited to be able to get a bigger space for it to do a little more. For the rest of this flight, I'm just playing around with it, having some fun. I think I'm going to be flying this a lot in the coming weeks as weather gets nicer. I hope that the build video helped you, and I hope that you enjoy flying your Crak Yak 39-inch as much as I do.